it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Wendigo Nation, Whispering Pines. The snowflakes fall as winter comes, and time just seems to fly. Whispering Pines, Whispering Pines. Tell me, is it so? Whispering Pines, Whispering Pines. You're the one who knows. J. Horton. Steam arose from John as he scuttled through the snow-laden pines, not only from his breath, but his entire body. He'd run for quite some time in the blistering cold. The inner layers of his clothing clung to his body in a sweat-soaked mess. By contrast, his wispy beard was frozen, as were the beads of sweat that had run down the length of his hair and now hung out from under the hood of his parka. Each breath seared his lungs with cold as he struggled to continue taking in oxygen. He had no idea whether he'd left behind his pursuer. He refused to pause, to look back at what might be following, closing in on his ever-slowing treads in the knee-deep snow. The eerie wailing cry arose on his right, and from slightly ahead, somewhere between a wail and a whistle with a breathy quality that sent fresh shivers down his spine. "It's past me," he screamed forlornly in his mind. He glanced around desperately, in search of a weapon of some kind. He didn't think he'd be able to fight the thing with the thin options available, perhaps not even with proper weapons. It had to be supernatural, some sort of evil spirit or demon. Its appearance alone gave him fright, though he'd only ever caught glimpses of pale skin and spikes or antlers, of emaciated limbs. It sang in a low, chanting voice that hinted of hunger for human flesh, that whispered of an awful end for him, followed by a feast for it. The whispers spread among the pines as he neared the fire road by which he'd entered the area, before he struck off down a forlorn wilderness trail. So much for getting away to a place that would inspire and inform his art. He came to a huffing stop. His breathing was ragged, and he gulped even more desperately for oxygen. There, on the ground, under the intertwined webs of a conifer where the snow had not been able to completely cover the ground. The perfect combination. A fairly straight branch, still somewhat green but broken off, twisted from the tree near the base, possibly by ice. Near it were 3 stones, about the size of chicken eggs and equally as smooth, river rocks. He gathered up his newfound arsenal, working through the pains of bending forward with his stiffening joints and shivering body. The cold set in almost immediately. He stuffed 2 of the stones into his outer pockets and hefted the 3rd, as he rested the branch on his shoulder. This is it. I'll have to make a stand. He took up a stance in front of the large fir where he'd found the weapons. Waiting, his back to the solid living wood, he prepared himself to confront the otherworldly creature. 5 days earlier, John lounged in the comfort of the first-class section of the flight from SeaTac to Whitehorse in the Yukon, the last frontier. It was the first vacation he'd allowed himself in several years. He'd always wanted to see the wilds of the Northwest, the land and the animals. It was springtime in the territory and adjacent Alaska, but still very cold. However, he had gear awaiting him, as well as guides and a few select fellow travelers. He looked forward to the isolation that he'd heard one could feel, even in the company of others, when trekking the vast wilderness spaces. It was exactly what he sought. He knew he was a tenderfoot and would need the guides and companions. It was unsafe to travel without them. Yet he hoped to avoid having to be the center of attention. It was a vacation, but he was an artist, so his imagination never stopped, and his work was his relaxation. There were 7 other hikers and 2 guides, so the party would total 10. He felt that would be a crowd, but the company manager/owner had assured him that there'd be plenty of time for quiet contemplation. They would travel on the legendary Yukon River, then by dog sled, and finally they'd hike into unblemished forests. The first night was easy. They stayed at a commercial lodge and met in the common room for supper. They met the guides, Harry and Ronald. There were jokes about the Harry Potter pals, of course, initiated by the pair of guides, who found it funnier than did John. Of the other 7 intrepid explorers, there were 2 couples, a pair of girls on their spring break / soon-to-be post-graduation trip, and an older man, Jim, who was retired and had decided that for his 80th birthday he'd explore a part of the world he'd not yet visited. He raised his arm. I had to heal and get therapy for a badly broken wing, so I'm a few months late for my birthday, but this was the plan all along. I used the therapy time to get back into better shape. I'm hoping to see a booger squatch of the great white north. John wasn't sure about the scarred octogenarian. Well, he looked fit enough for his age, but whatever, he concluded. His business, as long as he leaves me alone. What the fuck's a booger squatch? He wondered. The guys looked over everyone's gear and paired them so they could use a checklist to check one another again in the morning. John, of course, was stuck with the white-haired Jim. The old man gave him a twinkle-eyed, yellow-toothed grin. I know what you're thinking, Johnny. You'd rather we each be paired with one of them sweet young girls. Don't worry. If you like either of them, I'll take the other. At my age, I'm not choosy. He winked and then hefted his heavy pack. John wasn't sure whether the man was serious or joking. He was even more concerned that the young women may have heard the old lecture. Mostly, he just fumed because he hated being called Johnny. Well, we have a slow stretch. Time to trade positions. John, you're on bail, Ronald informed the troop of adventurers. Don't worry, we're over halfway through the wild water ride. Tomorrow it's genuine sled dogs. Everyone's going to sleep well tonight. There was a tired but satisfied chorus of, yeah. John was on a raft with his assigned buddy Jim and the younger of the 2 couples, Jorge and Jenny. The other crew floated just ahead in the bright sunlight. The water sparkled and the ripples in the relatively calm stretch slithered away from the hard rubber craft and blended back into the currents. With no bailing duties at the moment, John was free to relax and absorb the sights around him. The majestic peaks, the rugged timber, the sweep and colors were magnificent. He only hoped that he'd be able to capture the vibrant landscape in words at some point. For now, he simply absorbed it and made do with a few quick photos. Sitting still in the damp bottom of the boat was cold duty, and he soon began to shiver, despite his warm clothing. He knew that tomorrow they'd be making a slow, steady climb, and that with each foot they gained in altitude, it would get colder. He started, along with the others, when a scream erupted from the near bank. It was high-pitched and warbled in the crisp air. It quickly repeated. The members of the group peered all around the trees that stretched along the bank, except for Ronald and Jim. They just sat there, each noticing that the other was calm, and then they grinned at one another. Just a loop, Jim informed them. They only sound like lost souls. His grin grew wider. Good thing it's not the foo bird. Jenny asked, Why? What's a foo bird? And Jim looked startled. He never heard of those. He looked around to confirm that no one in the raft had heard of the creature. He was greeted with headshakes all around. Well, the first time I took a hike, just for fun. He tilted his head back and rubbed his chin. 1958. There were 3 of us. Tough boys. We lit out on our own, no guides, and it was way back in the hills. The ranger at the station told us that if we saw a large winged shadow and heard a loud screeching call, that it was the foo bird, a very rare, very dangerous, and very large creature, bigger than a condor. He warned us that it tended to poop before it attacked, but didn't like to go near its own mess, so if it pooped on or near us, just leave it in place until the foo bird flew onward. Well, sure enough, we marched on into the wilderness, and about midday, just like now, we heard a terrible screech from above and behind us. A pair of dark wings blotted out the light, and then, splat! Big bird turd landed on my buddy Jack. Oof, it was a foul-smelling load, full of ammonia stench, and he wiped it off without thinking. Well, nothing else happened, so we tromped forward and left Jack in the rear so that the stink would trail behind him without bugging Bob and me. After a while, Bob called to me and said, "Hey, Jack's gone." We looked all over and called his name, but no sign of Jack. He'd vanished. We decided it was time to get help, so we headed back towards the ranger station. Directly, we heard the roaring screech, and the shadow returned. Once more, there was a large splat. This time it landed directly on Bob's hat. The weight of that mess pulled the hat right off the back of his head. Didn't matter. We ran to get under the nearest trees. When I got up and under some nice full pines, I looked back. Bob was gone. Well, now I was truly frightened. I ran as fast as I could all the way back to the ranger station. Toward the end of my run, I heard the screech and saw the shadow. Just as I entered the shelter of the porch, there was a large splat on the roof. I told the ranger the story, and he shook his head and said, "I'm sorry, sir. There's no hope for your friends. As I warned you before you left, if the foo shits, wear it." Jim waited, and shortly, Ronald sniggered. John had to cipher out the fractured Cinderella metaphor before he gave a wry smile. Ronald explained it to Jorge and Jenny. He laughed, she didn't. Then the water started to rush once more, and they all had to pay attention. They met more of the White Horse Adventures team that evening as crew members picked up the rafts and introduced their dog teams. The next day they sped across the snow-covered landscape, always headed upward. During one of the breaks, the group gathered around for a hot lunch. The trees once more encroached on them, and Harry called for everyone's attention. "Oh, we're getting near the end of the sled run. The land gets rocky, and in a few hours we'll have reached the limits for the pups. Then we hike tomorrow. We have an added treat for you, a surprise. Well, the next campsite's a long-abandoned mining camp. Gives you all an option to explore the last place humans have touched in recent times. We'll have some time to explore the camp in the morning, and then we'll be in wilderness camps the next 2 nights, then back down to the big river before nightfall on the final day. Only a few miles down from where we embarked, and the last day and a half are all downhill. Oh, best of all, our team will have a couple of SUVs waiting to take us all back to the lodge for a farewell fling." That evening, as they sat around a few campfires and talked and sang and told stories, the older couple, Kim and Les, really enjoyed the second telling of the Foo Bird story. John peered around a little uncomfortably. The old buildings looked like the broken skulls of giants, empty sockets and yawning mouths leering in the night. He nearly jumped out of his skin when the merriment was interrupted by a loud, wailing call, a mournful and frightening sound that wound through the trees and quiet old buildings and sent a chill down every spine. All of the tired dogs that had been snoozing around the outside ring of the encampment sat up and yipped and howled, then whimpered and whined as they settled back into their resting places, each a little closer to its companions than they'd been before. Jorge looked at Ronald, then at Harry. "Seriously, what was that? Don't tell me that was no bird this time." Both guys assured Jorge and the rest that they had no idea what it was. No one on the crew had any offers other than maybe some kind of owl or wolf. Jim just sat and thoughtfully stared into the closest campfire. John suspected that the old-timer knew something, but he didn't ask. The old fart may have just been tired and frightened. When the sound did not repeat, they decided to turn in early for the big hike tomorrow. The fun was over anyway, and no one felt like telling spooky stories anymore. A bit after midnight, the peace was once again shattered, this time by one of the college girls. Her friend's shrieks soon joined in, and the cacophony awakened the entire camp, to include the dogs. They gathered back around the fires and stoked them once more for light and warmth. It was several moments before anyone could get anything coherent out of them. "I just finished using the potty. Dakota was waiting her turn. When I walked out of the little shelter, I saw it, that thing, back in the shadows. over her shoulder. It was horrifying. I've never seen anything like it. Thin and dead-looking, with spikes and thorns. She trailed off into shivering sniffles. Dakota looked even more frightened. When I saw the look on Hannah's face, I looked around and don't remember anything else. I don't want to. Kim and the two older female crew members soothed the girls, and in the end crowded them into tents with seasoned trekkers. No one got much sleep, and the crew members rotated a watch for the rest of the night. Early the next morning, the sled teams took off in their much-lightened vehicles. The dogs seemed happy to leave the area. John would be too. There had been some snowfall during the early morning hours, and the looming skull imagery of the previous night had given way to pitiful but still creepy wreckage in the dawn light, all coated in clean, glistening white. He felt the sharp stab of adrenaline shock in his heart as a large hand clapped down on his shoulder and a voice rasped in his ear. "Morning, Johnny. You figure out where you want to dig around in this old place?" John shuddered to shake off the rush of startlement, and then to hide his annoyance. He didn't like people with Jim's level of confidence. He felt that they were dangerous and too boisterous. He wanted some peace and quiet. He noticed with satisfaction that Jim picked up on his feelings and during breakfast strayed over to take a seat near the girls. He watched as the old man spoke quietly to both young women. He was clearly spinning some yarn, but there wasn't much laughter. The trio were mostly serious, attentive expressions. John took the opportunity to ignore the admonishments of the guides and sneak away from the rest of the group. Quickly he dodged around a few corners and picked up a pathway that led to some rocky outcrops that looked promising. Perhaps he'd find a mine shaft and a souvenir to evoke his memories when it came to type out his word art. Les and Kim did not ignore the guides. They spoke with them and responsibly pointed out the areas they intended to explore. They were more interested in the dwellings and other structures than in the mine shafts. They were celebrating their first empty nest year. The last of their 3 children was finishing up her freshman year and had volunteered to watch the house on her spring rake while they traveled for the first time in years. They were fit people who loved the outdoors and were looking forward to the empty lands that would greet them later today. "Hey, Kimmers, is that what I think it is?" Les pointed to the largest structure. Kim looked for a moment. "Oh, I believe so. It's a saloon, maybe the Red Dog Silo." They grinned and held hands as they approached the front doorway. There were no swinging doors this far north, but the front door had a welcoming look. It was partway ajar, beckoning them forward into its shadowy interior. It led to a vestibule where patrons would have removed snow gear and hung it on racks. Most of those were broken. Les took the first shift with the flashlight. The inner door was solid and closed. He turned the handle and pushed, as it turned out much harder than necessary. The door swung open easily and he stumbled forward into the gloomy main room. Kim followed quickly. "You all right, hon?" Les nodded, then realized that his spouse had likely not been able to see the gesture. "Sure, dollface. Let's take a look, but there's stuff on the floor, so be careful where you step." The room wasn't large. It would hold 30 people tops, no more than about 20 comfortably. The bar was sawn planks on top of old whiskey barrels. There was no upstairs like in the old Western movies. They were happy that the solid roof had provided more protection from the elements than would have the canvas top so common in short-term townships. They stopped near the entrance to a back room. There had been no storage area, just a pile of empty crates and a few empty or broken bottles on the other side of the bar in a corner of the room. Yet there was another room. Les glanced over his shoulder. Maybe the owner's bedchamber, do you suppose? Kim shrugged, which he didn't see. They crept toward the threshold to the curtained entrance. The curtain was a heavy quilt in amazingly good shape. Les paused at the entrance for a moment. You notice that the place isn't as dusty as you'd think." Kim shrugged once more, but it was accompanied by a giggle. Maybe the ghosts sweep to stay busy, since they don't get many visitors to spook. Les snorted and pushed aside the curtain. Jim finished up his parables and assured the two young women that they were strong and smart and would be able to overcome anything they encountered in the forest. He patted the long knife at his side. "Besides, a good pig sticker will get you out of all kinds of spots." He winked. "Oh, I've stuck all kinds of porkers, all of them scary, but look who's here talking with lovely ladies on a gorgeous spring morning." The girls smiled up at the old man and thanked him for his wisdom and encouragement. He flashed them his yellow grin and started to stalk off towards the nearby trees to take care of morning business, when Harry spoke up. "Mr. Broxton? Jim?" Jim stopped and looked back inquiringly. "What you got, Harold, of the Yukon?" Harry smiled a little through his otherwise concerned visage. "Do you know where your safety buddy is? We noticed that John's absent. Didn't tell us where he's going. We thought maybe he'd told you." Jim shrugged. "He walked off among the buildings almost a half-hour ago. I thought he was looking for some place to take a morning constitutional. Now that you mention it, he has been gone for longer than need be. Hope he didn't fall in." Jorge pushed Jenny back up against the wall of one of the sturdier old buildings and kissed her fiercely. She returned the passionate gesture, and they fumbled at one another's clothing. They were in their early 30s and hadn't cared about exploring anything but each other. Steam arose from both of them, even though they wore clothing that was lighter than it should have been for the conditions. Their building was on the edge of the little settlement, perhaps a church or other gathering place. Behind them loomed the forest and a surprisingly large trail or road. The sun was still too low to shed much light on it, and it remained in deep shade, almost as dark as the night. About the time Jorge found his way to a place that rapidly increased her excitement, Jenny's eyes blinked open for just a moment, then opened again in earnest and widened in surprise and fear. She moaned out a little cry that Jorge took for building ecstasy. He just started to congratulate himself when the piercing pain drove through his spine, exploded through his chest, and pinned him to his lovely, sweet wife when it entered her chest and exited her spine. John heard Ronald and Harry call out his name from the campsite. "Ah, crap," he thought. "Busted. Oh, guess I'd better head back." He hadn't found any mine shafts, but he had found a wonderful overlook. He'd taken some photos and completed a rough sketch and some notes to boost his memory when he wrote about it. He picked up his pace, and about the time the two guys repeated their calls from different areas, he rounded the last corner and came into view of the others. Ronald saw him and looked relieved. He and Harry approached him, and Ronald spoke quietly. "Please don't do that again. There's a reason we assign safety buddies and have people check out. We care first about the safety of each of our guests." John studied the ground at their feet intently. "I know, I'm sorry. I just needed some solitude. It's how I work." He was fine. Told you I'd find him and bring him back to the camp." The old man's voice rasped behind John. John looked up and around as Jim's hand clasped his shoulder. "I wouldn't let anything happen to dear John. You found a great overlook. Might be a good place to camp for your next group." He winked in his boisterous manner at Harry and Ronald, and John cringed inwardly. The old creep spied on me. Not sure dear Johnny's any better than Johnny. Les and Kim walked quickly down the street towards the rest of the group. When they saw the four men gathered and the two young women sidling up to the group, they decided to join them and tell them their news. "Hey guys, this place is kind of weird and spooky," Les interjected. "We found a room in the back of the saloon, probably the owner's personal quarters, but there were also cots lined up on one wall, 3 of them with curtains between them. The whole place was cleaner and in better shape than it should be." Harry and Ronald realized that almost all of the group had gathered. Harry cleared his throat. Likely it was used as a brothel. Not like in the movies. Out in these parts, folks would have crowded into a space to do their business. Hey, look, once Jorge and Jenny get back, we'll get together and plan out our hike for the day. It's a pretty easy trail, but there's this one water crossing that may be a little tricky, and the terrain is rough in places. Jorge! Jenny! Harry called out toward the overgrown fire road at the end of the town. John could hear Ronald calling faintly from the other end of the settlement, echoed by other voices from a couple of more directions. He and Jim stood near a large old structure to get out of the wind. He noticed that Jim was studying a snowdrift against the wall, probably considering whether to pee on it, he internally grouched. He was a little startled when the old man's rusty voice elicited his opinion. See anything on about this drift? John sighed and took a look. No, it's not as smooth as the rest, and it's big, but nothing unusual. Jim gave him a sidelong glance. Good. Anything else? John studied it for a brief moment. Nope. It's just a pile of snow. Who cares? Jim's look soured. If you compare it to the others, there's another problem. They were all against the northeastern walls. This is against the western wall. There are also, if you look closely, some odd, very large footprints and maybe some midden prints. It was packed in place. John's interest was piqued. He took a closer look. He had no experience to guide him except that of his safety buddy. He shrugged, and about that time Harry, who'd continued to call out for Jorge and Jenny several times while he and Jim studied the drift, approached. Guys, I think we really need to rally and organize a search. They may have strayed too far away to hear us and respond, or they may be in distress and unable to respond. Or they may even have found a cave or a shaft. He trailed off, clearly concerned and speculating aloud. Jim went through his Socratic routine once more, and Harry quickly noted the oddities. Those two carefully shifted the snow, brushed it aside a layer at a time. It soon turned from a white, clean pack to dark crimson with a faint metallic odor. John understood before Jim said it. Blood. Looks like it goes deep into the drift. We have been unable to contact the rest of the service team by radio, Ronald announced, so I'll take a safety pair back with me directly to the pickup site. We'll occasionally check the radio, but in any case, we'll get help. Rest of you will stay here with Harry and continue a limited search. Anyone want to volunteer to go with me? Dakota and Hannah and Les and Kim all volunteered. In the end, Ronald decided to take the two young women. They were clearly the most upset and in need of extraction. Les and Kim would be more calm and thus more useful in search than the girls would be. They gathered gear and set off within the half hour. Harry assigned Jim to his search team and put John with Les and Kim on a second search team to look for a specific sector and then meet in an hour. They would repeat the process to search different sectors. Then, once we search the town, we'll expand and do a 2-hour search in the wilderness areas. This is a very limited search. I'll take Jim, who's had tracking experience, try to find the trail from the snowdrift. This looks like animal predation, but I can't think of anything, not even a bear, that could snatch 2 grown humans with no noise or mess. He closed his mouth and looked at Jim, who nodded. John was a little energized. There was obviously a mystery, possibly a deadly one in play, but he could still detach himself from the fear for the safety of others. He wasn't in any danger. He was glad of his change in safety partners. Les and Kim seemed like steady types, and while they were sociable, even amiable, they were not as assertive and outward as was that old walking fossil Jim. John simply disliked the man's generation. Boomers. Yeah, they were selfish, self-righteous, and racist in his view. His professors had all agreed on that, even the ones who'd been boomers. He followed the couple as they returned to the saloon. They wanted his opinion on the place. They actually cared what he thought. Jim had just made him uncomfortable with his questions. he felt a little creeped out in the dark interior, but he agreed that there should have been more dust and more decay, he supposed. The little room in the back was pretty odd. Of course, he thought the entire town was odd. Who'd want to live in the frozen north? To stay out here in this isolated place all the time? What was wrong with these people? Were they just greedy colonialists, here to rob the native population of their resources? These glum thoughts pursued him as he tramped along in the wake of the rest of his team. They checked the rest of the structures in their sector. As they headed back for the first hourly check-in, he noticed that the sky had clouded and lowered. More snow. Harry and Jim approached, exactly on time. Annoyingly. He glowered at them, showing off their competence, flaunting their toxic masculinity. He wanted to commune with nature, but these people looked at the natural world as a challenge to be overcome. Definitely a trail, Harry began. We were able to follow a little way, but it soon became obscured. He looked up and sniffed. Definitely more snow on the way. Maybe we should make the next search 2 hours, getting as much as possible before it hits. The rest of the group agreed, and once they'd finished the building searches, John led his group to the overlook he discovered. At least to get some personal enjoyment from that. While Les and Kim crowded into the space that John had coveted, he stepped back into the tree line. The first flakes of snow drifted down, and the light breeze swirled them playfully about before they eventually and inevitably touched a surface and stuck there, steadfast to lay the foundation of a collection. His poetic thoughts were interrupted when he saw something out among the trees. Something pale, ghostly, spiky. He heard a murmuring, whispering chant, just on the edge of his hearing, and then Jorge's voice. "Come on, help." It was quavering, hungry, and a little off. Kim turned. "Did you say something, John?" There was concern in her voice. Les turned with her, his brow raised in question. They all heard the voice from an indeterminate distance. "Come, help, friend." Mostly Jorge's voice. Les spoke up, and John started a little. The voice had mesmerized his attention. Sounds like he may be hurt. Maybe Jenny's with him. Let's go see." He followed his own assertion and started to walk into the trees. John noted that the pale figure was no longer in sight. They walked toward the direction from which the voice had emanated. After a couple of 100 yards, they heard a voice to the right, Jenny this time. "Come on, we need help." They all turned like members of a flock. The voice sounded again from a little deeper into the woods. They walked towards it once more, and then the silence was broken by the beeps of the alarm on the watch that Les wore, to alert them that it was time to rendezvous at the center of the settlement. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.